Let's get started with our next panel, the nuts and bolts of DAO voting. Our moderator for this session is Dane Lund, the head DAO architect at Alliance, which is a leading Web3 accelerator and founder community. Nice to see you. I will turn it over to you, Dane.
Sure. Thanks so much, Kristen. I want to give a chance for our panelists to introduce themselves as well. So maybe, Justine, then Charles, then Kevin. If you could quickly, just let us know, who you are, what your background is, and then we'll get into it.
Hi everyone, I'm Justine. I'm head of DAO strategy at Rabbit Hole and also sit on the DAO Council at the World Economic Forum.
Hey guys, I'm Kevin. I'm the founder of Boardroom. We're a DAO governance aggregator and discovery platform.
And I think we're expecting Charles, but maybe we can, jump into one of the questions in the interim, and then I'll have him, jump back and introduce himself. I want to start by talking about, the times when people should or should not be voting. Given that DAOs, voting is really the most important function of DAOs. It's kind of the function through which everything else passes. And so I think the first point to think about is, when should community members have the right to vote, or when should they be voting, and then what should happen if they don't? Maybe Kevin, if you could give us a little perspective there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a great question. I think we really started a couple of years ago with this very utopian vision that everyone should be involved in every single governance decision that a DAO has to make. And right now, there's a little bit of an overlap between DAO operational decisions and some broader DAO governance decisions that honestly might not necessarily be relevant for the day-to-day of a DAO. I think where a lot of stakeholders are coming to realize now in this space is that there has to be some delegation of responsibility, of decision-making oversight across a variety of different decisions. And we're starting to kind of like categorize what those decisions look like, right? So I think in general, the ideal scenario for a DAO is to have this delegation of voting, not necessarily require every stakeholder to participate in everything, probably focus a little bit more on specialization of decision-making, who, is actually informed enough to make the decisions. And this will function even, better than some of the systems that we have today, so long as we have the proper accountability mechanisms in place, right? As you mentioned, Dane, like governance at the end of the day is at the very core. It's an anchor, to the entire point of why a DAO exists. What really differentiates a DAO from any other digital community, from a group chat, from a subreddit. Usually it's some sort of like shared treasury and a governance or decision-making process with rules that are enforced and ratified on chain or in some sort of blockchain mechanism. So I think where we started initially was, hey, everyone should use that system, use that framework to make every single decision in the DAO. Obviously, we've seen that DAOs can't scale like that pretty aggressively. So we're getting to a point where we're now starting to categorize the decisions, the decisions that are important to the day-to-day operations of the DAO, decisions that are important for the longer-term vision of the DAO, et cetera. And once we categorize those properly, we'll hopefully be able to assign the proper stakeholders, to make the right decisions across there. But definitely, I think we're leaning away towards the expectation that every stakeholder in the DAO should actually make the decisions. The biggest issue today is that we haven't actually mapped who the stakeholders are that should be making the decisions, who's actually specialized enough to do so, and what type of decisions are being made. And it's completely obviously dependent on the use case of the DAO too.
So I think that is very well put, and cutting out, spheres of, voting is very important. We're seeing experimentation with that, as you've mentioned, Kevin. Something that, I see a lot of people asking about is when should we, carve out smaller groups for voting, things like working groups or committees that handle specific matters. Justine, you've handled voting in a lot of different DAOs. What are your thoughts of carving out, voting groups?
For context, so I led Rabbit Hole's meta governance initiative, which was enabled our community members to vote with the tokens we held in our treasury. So we participated in governance for 9 different protocols. So right now, as Kevin was saying, how most governance works is every token holder votes on every proposal. So we're holding national elections for local issues, basically. And so what you want to try to do is localize decision-making to the people that have the highest context are voting on the things that are most relevant to what they're doing in the DAO. And so there's kind of like two approaches to doing that. And one is to delegate decision-making rights. This is like what Urine has proposed in their governance 2.0. That is basically that everybody has voting rights as to who the decision maker should be. So there they have something called Y teams, which are more or less working groups, and everybody has voting rights as to which Y team should or shouldn't exist. And then you basically elect who the decision makers over the budget of that group will be. And then, like Kevin said, what's really important if you're going to do this is that you have a mechanism to remove decision makers if they're abusing their rights in those positions of trust. I think we'll see more and more models kind of move towards that. And so therefore it's like minimal viable governance around what those groups are doing. You're not voting on every 10K transfer that group is making. And the second way to do it is to actually try to delegate who has specific voting rights. And if you're gonna do that, then there's several approaches, all of which are like experimental and not in practice yet, but you can try to do that based on identity, based on reputation, based on contribution. I'm sure Charles could talk more about that. Element's doing some cool work with their voting vaults around that. And then you're starting to see like what Optimism is proposing for their governance model is really interesting, which is this two-house, I think that's what they call it, two-house governance system, where certain decisions will be token weighted. So every token, holder will vote on those. And then other proposals, other decisions will be made based on a non-transferable NFT. So that some decisions are made one token, one vote, and others are made attempting to make it one person, one vote. So I think you'll start to see more of these models, just as Kevin said, it's not scalable to have everybody voting on everything, and not everybody has that relevant expertise to vote on every proposal, especially some more of the technical ones.
So taking it, one level up in terms of the voting, if we're thinking about, carving out spheres of delegation, we do rely on those who are delegating to vote, at least to some extent. And so one of the questions that I have is how we deal with voter apathy, because if we don't have participation, we don't really have a DAO. Charles, I see you're on, so maybe you could just give a quick background on yourself and then talk about how you think about dealing with voter apathy.
Yeah, of course, and sorry for the technical difficulties. Yeah, I'm Charles St. Louis. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Element Finance. I was previously at the Maker Foundation as the decentralized governance architect and the first person onboarded to the DAO as a mandated actor, working as a governance facilitator and, MIP editor for pushing proposals forward. In terms of how I see voter apathy, I caught a lot of what everyone was saying earlier, and I completely agree that I don't think the average person really wants to have interest in voting more than maybe once a few months, even once per year. And I think that's one of the reasons why people suffer from voter fatigue and voter apathy. Obviously, the voter fatigue, when votes are very frequent, they kind of fall off. And that's when the apathy kicks in, and the decisions around that often result in malicious proposals being put forward. So I think the main focus here is like around governance scalability. So what we really want to do is maximize the number of decisions that can occur in a given period of time that represent the community. So with representative models such as delegation and councils, like you get better outcomes because you have trust in these people making them better decisions because they're data informed, they're incentivized to actually look into the data, look at the understanding of what these proposals may have an impact on the actual DAO itself. So in terms of like voter apathy, I think just really pushing forward better delegation models, but also looking at ways to make delegation capital efficient. So as Justine mentioned, at Element, we've worked on these things called voting vaults, which essentially allow you to assign voting power to a specific position or use case. So you could have your governance tokens, let's say in Compound Maker, borrowing against it, or in an LP position, or using some sort of yield generating protocol, all the while still maintaining the ability to vote in delegating governance. So it's not like the typical voting contract where you have to put your governance tokens in there and all you can do is vote. So in a way, this is a baked in incentive like mechanism, because it allows people to just kind of pass off their delegation to who they trust to make decisions in the protocol while maintaining their exposure to the financial opportunities costs that they would have suffered if they just kept voting. So I think that's a worthy experiment. Obviously, all DAOs should experiment with these things, whether it's 3 months periods and then seeing if it works, that's great. If it doesn't, move on to something else. So I think people should just push forward experiments and test things. And I can talk a bit more about that, but I'll pass it back to you, Dane.
Sure. So let's imagine that we've come to a solution. There's some sphere of delegation. We have different groups, working on different types of actions, or have been delegated different types of authority. How do we think about building consensus once we have whoever our voter set for a relevant action is going to be, and how do we make sure that when we're doing that, it's not only the loudest voices that are heard, but every relevant stakeholder is heard? Maybe Kevin, you could start on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to this, but one thing I would definitely highlight at the core of everything is data, proper access to data and information. I think one of the biggest things right now that's happening in the DAO space is that there's so much fragmentation around the different processes and systems that are being used, the stakeholders that are involved, that it's really hard for anyone to wrap their head around what's happening in the first place and what decisions are being made, just because there's currently a little bit of a lack of standards, but there's also just a lot of different potential sources of information that people can consume context from, right, or derive context from. So I think one thing, there's a lot of other things that to highlight, but as we start to see these more and more flexible frameworks come out, including kind of like voting balls from Element, et cetera, we're going to see DAOs adopt different frameworks and different processes and systems completely dependent on their use case. We have to, taking a step back, we have to remember that the decisions that are being made across the board in different DAO types are always going to be very, very varied and diverse, especially as the space continues to grow, as we start to implement DAOs in different scenarios. So once we kind of like really start trending towards some sort of maybe standardization around different use cases or best practices at the very least. I think the big question to ask ourselves around once those decision makers have been identified, how do we properly communicate the information around the decision and who's making it to the stakeholders that we're trying to represent, right? If those 9 selected members for a specific type of decision are being selected, but we have a complete gap in information on like how we actually convey that decision, to the broader subset of stakeholders, which could be as diverse, as some of the current token holder distributions that we see in decentralized finance protocols and massive community protocols, et cetera. If there's a gap there, then that entire process breaks down. Then like, what's the point of just, of having those members make those decisions instead of just having the entire token holder set vote? The entire point here is really to build a more representative system, for the stakeholders to actually make these decisions. And one very simple way we can ensure that that's happening is just making sure that though that information, the context around the decision that's being made by that smaller subset of stakeholders is being properly communicated to the broader set of community members. So that's for me, that's kind of like the foundation, the core, of how we avoid essentially just unilateral decision making or misrepresentative decision making, or having someone, as you mentioned, kind of like aggregate and take over the power. I think just the opacity of the decision, of the information around the decision in itself is one of our first focuses. Should be one of the first things that we're focused on.
So Kevin's seen a lot of the data around, voting and DAOs, and Justine, you've seen a lot of the practice in voting on the DAOs. I'm curious if you have anything to add in terms of how people effectively or ineffectively build consensus, kind of on the ground for DAO voting.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. You do see, we did see a lot of groupthink, or just kind of like default to whatever the consensus was. We did experiment. So we were an MVP, so we were doing voting in Discord, which is not recommended. But we would have like, the voting recommendation options, and we would put like a random animal emoji as the first one to see if people were just like default voting to vote, like governance mining, etc. And yeah, like people would choose the animal emoji. We would really have to like actively try to engage the people that voted against consensus and ask them to share their views to create a better discussion and kind of not just default to whatever the winning option was. But it was something that we really had to like actively try to create discourse around.
That's yeah. So I mean, just to unpack that a little bit, because I know that our audience probably has differing, levels of experience. So a lot of there are a lot of different places where people put polls for voting. Discord, which is effectively the chat room of Web3, is often a place where people do this. It comes with its own attendant problems, but it's fast. Then we have forums like Discourse, which allow for more asynchronous communication in long form on votes. And then we have other forums where there are final votes like Snapshot, where you can you have a static vote that people vote on ultimately. So Justine's seen it all through this process. I just want to unpack a little bit of that. So as we're thinking about different forums, oftentimes we'll see different DAOs impose voting thresholds. So you can think of some of the large DeFi protocol DAOs have a certain number of tokens that you need to hold in order to create a proposal. And I'm curious, how you think about voter restriction, whether it's something that's useful in certain cases, or it creates in-group and out-group designations. Charles, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on kind of token and voting thresholds as a mechanism of governance.
Yeah, I think with thresholds, they definitely have a lot of value. Some of them may kind of appear to be more of a censorship, but if you think about it, if you have a certain amount of tokens that you need to propose a vote, it kind of incentivizes that person to, if they don't already have that threshold, to go and get adoption from the community, get people to back them on their idea, so that they actually have skin in the game to propose something of value to the DAO. So I think in that case, it makes a lot of sense, because it's kind of like a pre-filter for the actual proposal itself. If you're reaching out to the community, kind of campaigning for people to actually back you on this idea, if you can't actually meet that threshold, then you probably don't have a great idea and a great proposal for the DAO. So having a certain threshold in order to actually get to that first step is kind of a great filter for filtering out those garbage proposals or spam proposals that we see all the time. We actually did implement a threshold for our governance steering council with Element's governance system. So what that is it's a kind of emulation between a board of directors in traditional corporate governance and a mix between delegation. So if you meet this threshold of 110,000 voting power, you have a certain authority in the protocol to act as a visionary to push things forward. So you can put proposals directly on chain, you can spend a portion of the treasury, and you are trusted by the community to do these things. Because you've reached this threshold, aka trust in the community, you should be able to have some sort of expedited process of actually making decisions, as opposed to going through the regular governance process. So that's one thing I really wanted to talk about as well, and hear everyone's thoughts is, it's great that people are voted on by DAOs to actually be a working group or do these things, but if they have to go through the exact same governance process as everyone else, it kind of defeats the purpose, because they're trusted by people, they're compensated by the DAO. Why shouldn't they be able to have authority over their area of expertise to actually act? So if it's a protocol engineering team, they should be able to push changes or push emergency situation fixes. If it's a treasury working group, they should be able to spend up to a certain limit of the treasury. And without that and that trust in those people using these thresholds, then it kind of just makes more of a case for voter apathy, lack of governance participation, slow and inefficient DAO processes. So yeah.
To that point, just to add real quick, Charles, I think, one of the things that we see a lot is that the social consensus around a decision usually forms way before a proposal is even implemented. And I kind of see the governance process and the proposal creation process as kind of like just a ratification, of that social consensus that's formed before by the community. Thresholders are kind of like a really good way to essentially gauge that consensus, and even trusted delegates or trusted folks in the project too can also be a great way to essentially understand how that social consensus has come to bear before the proposal creation. So I think the creation of the proposal itself and the voting is kind of like the last mile, that last 10% of how the decision came to be. But most of the discussion, most of the discourse, and the actual shape that it takes is formed way before that.
One follow-up on the practical side, Justine, have there been cases in which there were proposals where you were a token holder where you either wanted to participate or thought you had meaningful participation to add, but were restricted by a threshold in any way? I'm curious if that comes up often.
No, I agree with what Charles said. I think if you have a proposal that's kind of worth having the community engage with, you can rally enough support and get people to put their tokens up for you to enable you to put it forward. So yeah, I think I agree with that. Like, I don't think that the token thresholds are preventing like meaningful quality proposals from getting put forward.
Okay. Turning focus just a little bit. I haven't seen this come up often, but I expect that it will more. Thinking about when token holders should recuse themselves from votes, and whether certain voters have duties to disclose potential conflicts. Should DAOs factor that into their voting policy in any way? Is there any way to enforce it? Does having a culture of disclosing conflicts actually kind of violate the trustless ethos of DAO culture, or does it reinforce faith in DAO voting? Charles, do you have any perspective on recusals and conflicts?
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one, and it's quite hard to enforce because even in traditional corporate governance, like there's a lot of oftentimes people forget to disclose certain conflicts of interest, and like it's more of a kind of personal issue as opposed to something we can use a technical solution or social kind of consensus to help vet out. So I think in DAO constitutions or DAO core principles, you should definitely have over communicate and transparency as a core principle. Enforcing it's another thing, but it's in the delegates or the governance participation's best interest to disclose any conflict of interest or anything that could affect their decision up front, because it could ultimately come back to them and then they'll just lose delegation support or trust in the community. So I think it's important to over communicate and be transparent, but actually backing it and figuring out how to eliminate any of those risks is almost impossible.
To kind of put a bow on that topic, one of the problems that Vitalik talks about and others see is the problem of collusion. It's part of the part and parcel of trustless voting, and it goes together with the civil problem for voting, which we don't need to spend a lot of time on here. But the idea of potentially the same actor or same set of interested actors voting multiple wallets without that being known to the community. So thinking through those are effectively implied conflicts. Thinking through it, I think, will be important, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do, particularly when we don't necessarily identify everyone to the community. Maybe thinking about improving voting structures. One of the things that I've seen is that many complex governance systems are hampered by the layer one system that the or protocol that the DAO is effectively built upon, and if it's like Ethereum and has high gas fees, governance can actually present a very significant transaction cost. So we've seen with things like Gnosis Zodiac an attempt to create effective bridges between layer one and layer two for some of the more intensive business to be taken care of on the layer two. I'm curious, maybe Charles, you could speak to how you think of the development of the layer 1, layer 2 integration, how important you think that is, whether you think it enables systems that we haven't seen yet that might be effective. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's an exciting topic. I mean, there's a lot you can do to eliminate certain like Sybil resistance, and definitely some interesting projects out there who've implemented, including like quadratic voting from Gitcoin, or quadratic contributions for their public goods infrastructure. But yeah, one of the things that we've been working on, as I mentioned earlier, with voting vaults is essentially a way to have an L2, L1 synthesis vault. I know the name sounds intimidating, but essentially allows you to vote on L2, and L1 just posts it to, and then using a Merkle root, it posts to L1. So you can vote on L2 and it's recorded on L1. Another way to kind of prevent the collusion or increase Sybil resistance is to have things like councils, where if you do meet that threshold and are on board and trusted by the community, you can assign each member of the council to have one vote. So if there's 10 people there, they each have one vote. It's not like they have like certain token powers, like one has 500,000 tokens, one has 200, as long as they're all at the threshold. And then like one person could be like a benevolent or non-benevolent dictator and just make all the decisions. So having certain groups where each person has one vote is Sybil resistant as well, which could be interesting. And then combining things with delegation, Sybil resistance, and all of that is also helpful. I haven't seen that many structures that tie in like different use cases for the different stages of voting between like the full DAO, sub DAOs, working groups, and like how they all like work with each other. I think an interesting project is Orca, and their pod structure is how you can kind of set up these certain groups who get could be assigned voting power from the DAO, and they'll all work together. Because that's one thing I've noticed, especially from my experience with Maker, is like there's I think 10 or more core units or sub DAOs of these projects, but the way they communicate together is kind of like fragmented and not, there's no real great place for them all to get together and chat and therefore potentially collude or agree on things. But I know I'm rambling a little bit much on this stuff, but I think experiment, just like keep trying these different models. I think you can use conviction voting at an early level. You can use L2 for signaling, but ultimately you do kind of want on-chain kind of accountability when you're executing anything to the protocol, because I mean, paying for a massive decision is kind of not a huge deal at the end of the day.
So I want to break down two concepts in great simplicity and then put it back to you, Charles, to explain a third. So, I walked into layer 1, layer 2 with the expectation that it's, everyone's just thinking about these things all the time. But, effectively layer 1 is often the protocol that, serves the base function of, some utility. Ethereum's the most common to speak about. Layer 2 is an extension usually that connects that chain where, computations or transactions may be booked off of that chain and then proved back to the initial chain by a Merkle root, which is what Charles had mentioned. I know at Stanford, so a lot of people probably deal with that, but just to clarify for anyone who doesn't. And then, Charles, I think it'd be really helpful to just speak to the vault voting, and we'll talk about the other types of voting, but I've seen a few people ask about that. So maybe you can speak about, vaults.
Yeah, so I'll reiterate from the beginning because I kind of just jumped into it without context, but a voting vault is essentially a tool or kind of template where you can assign voting power to a specific use case. And I know that's broad, but for example, you could have a compound voting vault where governance tokens are put in compound, borrowed against, used in DeFi, and you still have the ability to get delegate or delegate to yourself and participate in governance. So that extends a lot further. I mean, the real interesting one that I think will kind of come over the next 6 months, hopefully from our community, is like the L2, L1 synthesis vault, an identity vault. The identity vault is something that I really want to see happen. And like I have a lot of thoughts on that area, but essentially it really emphasizes and kind of brings more the idea of inclusivity to governance, because a lot of governance systems generally just have like governance tokens, and that's the only way you can vault. So you can either participate in that protocol to earn those, depending on the protocol, or you can go and purchase them on the market. So there's a capital barrier to actually voting in governance, which is a big problem. So with an identity vault, it essentially provides voting power to the people who are working in the trenches in your community, the people on Discord, the people on GitHub, the people in your forums, all adding value and creating proposals, assigning them voting power so that you can balance out the different people in the community and ultimately have a more collective decision-making group for the DAO. For the actual L1, L2 synthesis vault, just to go back to what Dane just said about like the difference between them. So essentially L2 would post a balance tree hashes and L1 would vote using the Merkle balance proof on L2. So it would allow people to be on L2, do anything that they want there, but also maintain the ability to vote on L1. So if capital is a barrier, you wouldn't have to pay every time you'd vote or delegate. So that's a huge plus for a lot of people in the community. It's more inclusive.
So on the topic of inclusion and kind of bringing this topic back to what we were speaking about before, one of the things that I've noticed is that several DAOs reach a layer of complexity where it's almost impossible for new entrants to come in and have representation on par with incumbents, and that can create a lot of effectively aristocratic systems and a lot of effective power consolidation. So Justine, I'm curious how you think about designing fair and balanced voting systems that allow people to obtain equal voting representation as incumbents. Like what works for promoting new people to come in and feel like they're able to at some point have representation that's consistent with those who have come before.
Yeah, so we think a lot about this at Rabbit Hole. One of our kind of parts of our mission is to educate and onboard new people to Web3. So part of it is what Charles mentioned, like having some gasless or lower gas cost signaling option. A lot of it has to do with education. So education as to why participating in governance is important and then how to get involved. So we've done a lot of work with our community to help them understand that, but also education on some of the proposals and making it more digestible. So for example, DYDX recently had a proposal. It was just a link to a 40-page research report. So for somebody who's kind of like new to that community, it's not really a reasonable expectation that they're going to read through that and understand, all the formulas, et cetera, that are in there. So it's also partly like, how do we present the information to the community? But the other kind of topic this brings up is the idea of delegation and or meta governance, which is what we were working on at Rabbit Hole. So there's two definitions of meta governance, but what I mean when I say that is the participation of a DAO in the governance of another DAO. And so how that works at Rabbit Hole, for example, is that our users could delegate to Rabbit Hole, and we could vote with the tokens we have in our treasury kind of on their behalf. You can delegate to individuals as well, but there's some like pros and cons. For an individual delegate tends to not be as scalable if they're covering multiple protocols versus if a DAO is covering multiple protocols, there's probably multiple contributors helping to do that. Also, having a DAO do it eliminates any single point of failure in one individual delegate. So I think over time, we'll probably see more meta governance initiatives develop. Right now, it's mostly Index Coop, Wildfire, Rabbit Hole was doing it, but I think we'll see more and more, and those will be in a way kind of like political parties that you can delegate your votes to, depending on like how they're going to make decisions and if you feel like that represents your voice or not. At Rabbit Hole, for example, we were our dual mandate was to represent the voice of everyday users because that's who our user base was, but also to promote the long-term sustainability of the protocols themselves.
I think that's well put, and thank you for describing meta governance because it's such an interesting and kind of cutting edge topic. I want to make sure people kind of follow it. So I think, Justine, you really described well kind of the principled point of helping to make sure there are new entrants and that they feel like they can participate. There are some other mechanisms that we see in terms of the style of voting that people are using as alternatives. I'll mention some and I won't define them right now, but if at the end I can kind of give some clarity. There's quadratic voting, there's square root voting, holographic consensus, conviction voting. Charles, you've already mentioned, voting vaults. I'm curious, whether you think these are, strong fixes. You can either speak at a high level and just talk about, the fact that there are many different types, or you can address them specifically. Kevin, maybe you could talk about, the theory of multiple types of voting and what you think about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it just gives DAOs and stakeholders flexibility, right? If we're really trying to implement different systems here and looking at a very high level, a lot of the the things that we just discussed, especially around meta governance and how to properly inform stakeholders and delegates, et cetera, and even the fact that different entities are now getting involved in the governance process just makes the entire system and community more resilient, right? Because you have diversity of stakeholders making decisions. But that also brings, the biggest issue to the table is that it's really hard to fit a variety of different user personas into a single framework or into a single voting system sometimes. So what the beauty of Web3 is that you essentially can iterate in a very open source and modular manner to the point where we can just mix and match different mechanisms of voting, decision making, et cetera, across the entire process. As you mentioned, not to dive into any specific type of voting, but in a very broader sense, I think what all of these different types of voting bring to the table is that DAOs completely dependent on who their user personas are. And by the way, that's something that a lot of folks haven't identified yet, but completely dependent on who their stakeholders, user personas are, and who, who's actually making the decisions too, as well as their use case and what decisions they have to make, can essentially almost, use these different voting types as modular Lego building blocks and experiment and iterate constantly until they get to a point where they do think that they're representing the broader subset of stakeholders. So I think this is something super fascinating that honestly we just haven't really seen before. Different mechanisms to really quickly change governance structures and decision-making structures, iterate constantly and essentially change, in a very fast way. I think with different decision-making systems, obviously at the nation-state level or in a corporate governance level, et cetera, that changing those systems is a really, really slow process. What these modular governance Lego building blocks bring to the table is just a very simple way to modularly essentially develop processes that we think match our values and the representation of the broader stakeholders more accurately, very quickly. I mean, again, this in the last 2 years, we've already seen a massive, explosion in the experimentation of different systems too. So I think that's why I'm a little more skeptical that the entire space is going to kind of evolve around one single specific standard, just because I see all of these governance building blocks as open source primitives that people can constantly iterate, customize, and play around with. So I think what we'll end up with is this massive network of a lot of different experiments all interacting with each other, where meta governance also comes into play too.
My apologies. I think that's a very good discussion of kind of the higher level of thinking about how all these types of voting come together. I think there's a lot of experimentation that needs to happen to figure out exactly where the specific application matters. Charles, I know you've thought a lot about the specific applications, so I'd like to give you a chance to speak about your thoughts on where different types of voting do have important applications in the current environment. And I'm happy to riff with you on kind of trying to define these types of voting. But if you want to kind of give your impression before speaking to it, it might be helpful for the audience.
Yeah, of course. And back to what Kevin was saying, there is no standard for voting. It is very use case dependent. I think what we can do as an industry is to build more flexible and modular systems at the base level of governance so that you can try these things as experiments. If it's a modular system, you can go and grab these different types of voting, try them out for a while, and if they don't work, just move on. So there's a lot of systems that are non-upgradable, they're not flexible, so you can't really alter these different types of voting and different methods of signaling and all these stuff. So it gets really tough. So the solution that I have in mind is to just build a system that you can do these things. And as we've seen, the history of governance ever since humans existed is that governance fails. It's never working perfectly for any use case. So all you can really do is have things that adapt. And learn from their mistakes and move on. So we should do that with our technical solutions as well. As for the types of voting and which stages they make sense, I think conviction voting, or a portion of it, is definitely interesting at the early level of voting. So with conviction voting, you're essentially continuously voting and staking on top of decisions, and that really signals the prioritization of something. So maybe not complete conviction voting, but I think a really great way of using that type of system is the early on side of things. So when a proposal is first made, let's say there's 10 proposals in the forums ready to be talked about, discussed with the authors, having conviction voting, a continuous way to signal which ones should be put up to the top, which should then move to the next stage of voting, is really a great use case. Because in many cases, when proposals are put forward, it's more based on time. So a proposal put forward, a week passes, it moves to a vote. That's fair. But if there's 10 proposals there and you have to wait for the most important one at the bottom, that takes 10 weeks. So if you have a conviction way to actually prioritize proposals, it reflects the healthy political dynamic of the system more. So people can actually choose the most important one to be prioritized and move forward. As for holographic consensus, I think it kind of goes under the radar, and the name is a little intimidating, of course. Holographic, it sounds very futuristic, but essentially allows you kind of to have a prediction market on the best decision for the DAO, and obviously the ones with the most decisions on it are most likely to be the best option. And I think a great example of that is DAO, which has voted on over 50 proposals. There's 60 people in their core contributor group. There's over hundreds of millions of dollars in the treasury, and it's been operating for almost 2 years very successfully. And I think that's a very good example of what Kevin mentioned, is that this system works very well for that use case. It may not work for everything, but they went ahead and tried this experiment. With voting vaults, it's not so much specific use case. For example, you could have a conviction voting vault. You could have a voting vault basically do any type of voting, and it's up to the people who actually would use it. So in my case, I might want to go and use an LP position vote because I want to provide liquidity while maintaining my ability to vote. So it's more of a broad kind of tool rather than a specific way of voting. It essentially just allows you to assign voting power to something. I'll pass it back to you, Dane, if you want to kind of riff with me.
No, I mean, I think that's well put. Thinking of, one more, or thinking of quadratic voting as a method. Quadratic voting allows you to effectively, it can be implemented in different ways. One, you can effectively have divisible votes that can be attached to different topics based on, the level that you care about it. It's often a good way of navigating between, majority and minority rights in a voting system. Another way to implement that, which is an approximation, is to use, a square root or logarithmic type of voting. What that does is often it smooths out, concentration. So highly concentrated votes all of a sudden have less influence, but it's not perfect. Now, some like Goldfinch are using this, and they're using it quite successfully. One of the drawbacks of quadratic voting when implemented on chain is that you have to figure out how to deal with some of the Sybil problems. Again, if people procure more wallets, they're able to gamify the quadratic nature. So a lot of people are using proof of specific identity NFTs as part of this voting process to manage the Sybil problem. That obviously has a scalability issue. There are some more interesting mathematical equations that are going into probabilistic quadratic voting as well that try to solve that as well, but probably beyond the scope right now. Something that I have noticed that gets little attention is the fact that we've effectively adopted consensus on a few very important tools for voting. So we see very little differentiation in which proposal system is used. Discourse being one of the most frequently used. Then we see some, but not much variation on the I could say ultimate voting forum. Snapshot is used by very many DAOs, much because it allows for gasless voting. and reduces the cost. There's obviously Governor Bravo and some other methods that are used, but we are seeing consensus build. And on the one hand, it might be helpful to have defaults and mechanisms that, different users are very familiar with. On the other hand, I'm wondering if there's innovation we're missing out on. I don't have a specific vision of what that is, but maybe you can think of, whether or not there are use cases we're missing out on. And I think each of you probably has a perspective. Maybe I'll start with Kevin and then go from there.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason I probably give around that, I think, is that right now there's a very, very low marginal cost of spinning up something that's tried and proven, especially if, at the end of the day, governance for a lot of these DAOs isn't in their core value proposition, right? They're not necessarily building an innovative or new governance system. Now, obviously, we really appreciate the folks that experiment and try with that, but the long tail of DAOs, the 90% of DAOs that actually don't have, the resources to really spend time innovating kind of like in governance, aren't going to do so because it's not part of their core value prop. They're spinning up a DAO for one very specific reason, one very specific use case. I think even, especially with some of the newer types of use cases that are coming to market around music and art and curation and investment DAOs, et cetera. A lot of these are, very, very specific, very focused DAOs with not too many participants as well, especially in their earlier days. Now, so when they're spinning up a DAO, the marginal cost of actually, experimenting with some new governance system or the risk that they're taking is actually pretty high. So I think what we're seeing now is that, we're trending towards standards or tried, tested, and proven models. Because a lot of the DAOs just don't want to spend the time and resources just thinking about governance as one of their core features, one of their core functionalities. However, I think as we continuously kind of like experiment with these open source primitives and these modules and these governance structures, that cost of implementing something new and innovative and different from the standard might actually change enough that new DAOs actually, would want to experiment with that. But I think the core reason why we're seeing some, standardization right now, or some consensus around the process in itself, especially around, tools like Snapshot, as you mentioned, Discourse, et cetera, is because the marginal cost of spinning that up is so low for the DAO. And most DAOs, 90% of them, just don't want to focus on building a new innovative governance system because it's not part of the core value prop that's going to forward, their goals or their use case specifically.
It's well put. Justine, do you have perspective on kind of managing multiple types of platforms?
Yeah, so in the first quarter, we executed like 80 votes across 9 protocols. And so I think platforms like Boardroom and others help a lot with aggregating kind of all the information between off-chain and on-chain votes and forum discussions, et cetera, and helping to keep track of that. But there's no real standardized process for how any of this works across the protocols. And so that's where we ran into some issues trying to keep track. For example, like not all protocols have delegation. Some protocols you can vote on Snapshot, but not as a delegate. Some protocols allow you to do a gasless option, but then you have to like stake their tokens in order to do that. Some protocols, a lot of them have their own governance forums. So I have to log into like 12 different accounts to comment on things. And so the same goes for actually like the actual proposals, and back to this like voter getting more people to participate. When Aave v3 was launching, there were lots of proposals to integrate with new assets, and kind of each one of those proposals looked totally different. And so midway through, somebody actually proposed, can we have a standard template for what integrating with a new asset on v3 would look like? And that just makes it much more digestible for people that are trying to vote. So I think just actually like as boring as it is, like some best practice development around what the actual processes for these voting across protocols is.
And it's really interesting, particularly given that we, often theorize that, people should choose to stick to like 1 or 2 DAOs. But if you create efficient pathways for people to vote across DAOs, like Rabbit Hole, then you might be able to open up user adoption for users who vote on very many protocols and are able to remain active. Charles, do you have any thoughts on this? And I know that you have spoken about fractionalizing and fragmenting governance. I want to give you a chance to weigh in as well.
Yeah, I think this is a very important topic. And I mean, as Kevin mentioned, there's a low-hanging fruit to using snapshot and discourse. It's a very common thing in the industry. I think in many cases, when a project is purely just launching their governance through snapshot and then a multi-sig and then snapshot and then the actual DAO, it's largely a part of like the lack of bandwidth on their like core team to actually build out and really think about governance and what they want to do. And it's kind of like a crutch to lean on until they actually figure out the full direction of governance and where they're going to go, whether that is to evolve into like something greater or stick with what they got. But I think in this day and age, and with respect to regulation, a lot of projects really need to kind of think more deeply about full decentralization, and using things like just snapshot because it's easy and a multi-sig because it's easy to coordinate and do those things will have long-term effects on actual decentralization, because it's in fact a small group of people actually making the decisions at the end of the day. As for the comments on fragmentation of governance and why I think platforms like Boardroom and Commonwealth are very great options for early projects, is because in many projects, you have to have 9 tabs open to actually vote on a proposal in governance. You have to look at the proposal, you have to look at the forums, you have to look at the discussions on Discord, you have to look at the governance dashboard. And it's just way too much noise to actually make a decision. So platforms like Commonwealth essentially allow you to look at the forum directly there, be able to vote directly in the forum, whether it's off-chain or on-chain, and have everything in one place, so it makes it easier. It's still noisy, but it makes it easier. Yeah.
I think that's right. Having, aggregation of, information relevant to governance, even if it's not, using the same tool to actually implement governance is very important. And so then being able to see the data, being able to integrate into what I'd call a meta platform, not to be confused with meta governance, but something that allows you to see across different DAOs, but isn't necessarily the actual voting, implementation on chain. Like, I think that's very helpful. I want to, we have about 8 minutes, so maybe we can just cover the ways that we can think about delegating more technically, because this has come up quite a bit. The dynamics between the voters, the treasury, and the delegates themselves. So, one of the things is, thinking about when and how we use delegates and how we identify them. Like, are there best practices there? Are there best ways to rank them and the likes? Charles, maybe you have some thoughts on the mechanisms of delegation.
Yeah, normal delegation is essentially me delegating my votes to Dane because I trust him to make decisions on my behalf. I think voting theory can get very complex and like very mathematical, but there are some really cool things that I think should be researched further. And that is like one, partial delegation. So I can delegate to 2 people with my balance from one wallet. Now that one gets a little tricky from like the math standpoint and also from the representative standpoint, because if I'm delegating to Dane and he's delegating to Justine and she delegates back to me, there's no real way of actually seeing who you're actually delegating to and who's representing you. So it gets quite complicated on like those kind of ABCA like models. For ranked choice, I think it's like the healthiest way to like push it forward. So I can choose the top 3 people I want to vote for. If the first person I choose isn't available for that vote, it goes to the second and then to the third. This makes voting a lot more human, because delegates are basically assumed to be around 24/7. They're humans, they have lives. Maybe one week they're off and they can't vote. So your vote is then missed. So having ranked choice is really great for many reasons. And I think that's something I personally want to explore more and actually experiment with.
All right. So Kevin, do you have any thoughts, in terms of the information level, how to think about delegates?
Yeah, I mean, to your point of how we actually identify and rank delegates, one thing we get asked a lot about is the subjective information around a delegate, right? So not only tracking that hard data around who's delegating to who and what decisions they made previously, but also, who that person is. Now, that gets really interesting when you start talking about reputation and pseudonymity in the space, and how we really want to handle identity in general. But I think just right now in the early stages, what we're seeing is just a trend towards, well, initially, I guess, towards just essentially announcing yourself as a delegate, providing some subjective information with a templatized model. And, folks can reference that when making that decision. But because, that varies wildly across different projects, and because it's very difficult to subjectively rank that too in any way, what we're trying to look for at the very least at Boardroom 2, and what folks have suggested, is finding ways to just standardize how we present that information, how we disclose different voting, voting decisions as well, so that people can, at the very least, keep those delegates accountable, not only based on their voting history, but most importantly, who they are and what their mandate is as a person/entity when it comes to meta governance too. But absolutely, really hard when you start thinking about, different reputation and identity models around that. It's a pretty tough thing to build.
So Justine, how do you think about, there's the individual level of delegation, and there's kind of the meta governance level. You could actually delegate, a DAO to vote your own, or if you're a DAO, your own, tokens on another DAO, for instance. Can you kind of walk us through how you've seen delegation work at the meta level, and whether you have thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages there?
Yeah, I mean, delegating to a DAO works the same way as delegating to anybody else. So they'll have they should have their own governance wallet, and then you just delegate to that address. Like I mentioned before, some of the advantages of delegating to a DAO versus an individual are just that you're not relying on one person. It's more like delegating to a political party as opposed to one politician. Right now, delegation's not compensated. There's talk that maybe it should be, but if it's not, I think whoever you're delegating to, you can have delegation without actually holding the tokens. Most meta governance or DAOs are doing governance because they already have tokens in their treasury. That may not be the case with any individual. So regardless of who you're delegating to, you want to make sure their incentives are aligned with that of the protocol that they're voting in. I think it's more common for that to be the case in meta governance, but it's not always. So I think, yeah, those are the general kind of pros and cons of individual versus meta governance. I think, like we mentioned, one of the challenges for all delegates right now is that there's not really a business model around this, and it's an incredible amount of work to stay on top of, to fulfill the duties of a delegate. So that's something that needs to be explored.
Last question. So you raised a fairly controversial topic now, which is how should delegates be compensated and whether or not they should be. I'm curious if you have a perspective whether the Treasury should compensate the delegates, or if there should be others, other forms of compensation. Should it come from the token holders? I'll leave it at that.
I think that Charles might have some more thoughts on that.
Maybe Charles, do you want to?
I absolutely think that delegates and working groups and any service provider of a DAO should absolutely be compensated, because if you don't do that, essentially their effort reduces, their work goes down, malicious proposals can sneak in, and it's detrimental for the DAO. So two things, I think, with what we've seen in DeFi over the past 2 years with liquidity mining. So basically reward incentives for participating protocols on the finance side is great, but it kind of gives a short-term user base for these protocols, which may actually be theater. So it kind of gives you a false sense of who your users are in the short term. Yeah, it's great, brings people to the protocol, but what I'd like to see in the industry this year and next is more governance mining initiatives. So actually more broad incentives for governance, because at the end of the day, these DAOs will not succeed if their governance is not healthy, and without those incentives or experimentation there, then the DAO could ultimately fail, and then the whole finance side of it kind of becomes irrelevant. So looking at compensation, and I know Dane, you brought up something great last week when we were chatting, is it would be cool if I'm delegating to you, that I kind of pay you a fee for your services. You could have a combination of that, or you could have the Treasury also compensating them. And lastly, I think if the protocol is generating fees on whatever thing they're doing, maybe it's not DeFi, maybe it's some other use case with NFTs or another thing. Having the fees from that go to actual contributors could be an interesting way to go about as well. But absolutely, I want to see more experimentation there. Couldn't agree more.
I think we're at time. So I want to, thank everyone for joining us and giving some excellent, detail around what it's like to vote, what the issues are, and how we can think about, voting prospectively in DAOs.